Princeton University's Keller Center, educating leaders for a technology-driven society.
I'd like to welcome you to this exceptional forum. It's sponsored by the Keller Center for Innovation in Engineering Education, the angel investor organization Jumpstart New Jersey, and also the Drinker Biddle Heath Law Firm. And we thank our sponsors for arranging and supporting this forum. You're in for a real treat this afternoon. You will hear from three leaders in the field of healthcare technologies. And you'll hear it from several different perspectives. This perspective of investors, the perspective of company builders, the perspective of technologists. You'll hear about pharma technologies, medical device technologies, and cellular treatment technologies, some advanced technologies. You'll learn about industry characteristics and industry trends. And most importantly, these industry leaders will share with you their perspectives on the challenges, the opportunities, the realities, and the strategies for starting, building, financing life science technology companies to success. We're going to take each of the speakers in order as they're arranged at this table. And I refer you to the backside of your announcement, which has their biographies. And I'm not going to take their time to introduce them by way of background, but merely to say that Hal is going to talk about the biopharmaceutical opportunities and challenges. And Jonathan is going to speak about medical devices and bioengineering. And Bob is going to talk about cellular treatments and advances that his company, Cellular Therapeutics, is making. So we'll start with you, Hal.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, Ed, for inviting me, and thanks to Jane Maggard. It's great to be back at the engineering school where I graduated a very long time ago. I'm going to talk very briefly about the biopharmaceutical industry, why it's different from all other industries, and sort of what it takes to be successful today. And as I do this, you're probably going to be asking yourself why anyone would be so crazy as to try to develop a new therapeutic entity today. And it's the same reason we've always done it. The rewards are absolutely enormous, both in a financial sense and in a societal sense. So this is a business that's changed enormously since its inception in the 80s and 90s, which I call the glory days of biotech investing. And in those days, we had a distinct biotech industry that made large molecule therapeutics, monoclonal antibodies, recombinant proteins, and we had a big pharma industry that made small molecule drugs and did not believe in large molecules, never thought they'd be important. They were wrong. They turned out to be multi-billion-dollar products. Wall Street fell in love with biotech and threw money at it. And we had a happy circumstance, which, mindful of the fact that it's fall and we're in Princeton, I'll use a football analogy. We venture capitalists would gather on the 20-yard line and gather up IP from academia, great ideas that could result in products. We'd fund it with some money, hired development people who had these skills, largely came out of the pharmaceutical business, to get the products to market. In some place along the line, but usually just about entering the clinic, occasionally before, you could take a company public through an IPO. And eureka, this was a liquidation event for investors, for entrepreneurs. And it's like scoring a touchdown on the 50-yard line. The public put huge amounts of capital into taking the program there to market at very low cost, so we enjoyed a great cost of capital advantage over the pharma industry. So today, that's all changed. Sometime around the 2000 dot-com bust, the IPO market for this kind of company disappeared. So today, an exit event is selling your product or company to Big Pharma. Big Pharma, just like the public markets, got somewhat burned before 2000, so they will pay big values for these opportunities, but only when they've been largely de-risked. So you call that the 80 or 90-yard line. Venture capital, which works backwards from that, finds this investable now when the program is reasonably de-risked as well. So this has to be at least to the point of, let's say, proof of principle in man, which leaves a huge gap between the 20-yard and the 50-yard line. I call this the venture philanthropy gap. My apologies to any angels in the audience. But where do you go for funding? Well, angel investors, the NIH, the government, foundations, academic resources, second mortgages. It involves real thought and care in this. This is the most exigent zone of development today. Lastly, the exits themselves are no longer real exits. They're structured exits, which means the investors get their money back when you sell it to Big Pharma, but any profits, any returns are deferred to further conquering risks in clinical development, in regulatory approval, and in commercial development. So quickly, let's just talk about what's driving this. We all know we have an aging population. Over 65s will almost double in the next couple of decades. It's the same in Europe. It's the same in Eastern Europe. It's the same in Japan. And give or take a decade or two, it'll be the same in China. They all demand more health care. We spend more than any nation on earth as a percentage of our national income on health care. Prediction, we're going to look more like other nations in the future. But that hasn't stopped it from growing. The entire healthcare debate last year did not slow the increase in the piece that healthcare represents of our national income. Healthcare reform means at one level a bigger mandate, more insured lives, and more expenditures. So what's important to us is how does all this impact what we're doing in the biopharmaceutical business? That business is struggling to develop new product. This is a curve in constant dollars. You can see it's exponential. This is the average annual expenditure to develop new products, $65 billion this year. But new product approvals are going down. The FDA is operating in an increasingly conservative environment. It's at some level a politically driven organization. Congress occasionally kicks it to produce more cancer drugs or more AIDS drugs, but today the message is safety. And the safest thing of all is not approving drugs. So this is probably the biggest challenge we're facing at the moment. The quotient of those two is this oft-quoted figure, the average annual cost of developing a new drug. It's $1.5 billion this year. That's before you see $1 of sales in the end of a 10 to 15-year process that has a single-digit probability of succeeding when you begin it. 60,000 compounds, which are candidate drugs, not discovery, but going into development, will yield one out of clinical development and maybe a half out of regulatory approval. It's the very fact that they are so expensive that makes an approved product, and the approval is coupled to a specific patent on a specific molecule, so enormously valuable. This is the one thing that's so different about this business than any other. No place will you find such a value placed on a patent position. The downside of that is when the patents expire, the profitability evaporates, and this reverts to a generic business. Generics don't look like pharmaceutical companies. You might as well be talking about the copier industry. So that's the end of it. So the world biopharmaceutical industry is facing today the biggest challenge it's ever faced. The top 8 firms are going to see 36% of their sales disappear next year due to patent expiration, and another 36% the year after that. This cliff is something that all the success from all the innovators in this room and the industry are not going to avoid. They are going over a cliff which is driving mergers and acquisitions. It's why you saw Merck acquire Schering-Plough last year, why Pfizer acquired Wyeth, and you'll see this happening at an accelerating pace. But in combination and keeping the top line together is shrinkage, and the industry is shrinking. That's because it's had such a darn hard time developing new product. The good news for folks like us is it has become dependent on the venture-backed entrepreneurial innovator companies to create that product. So now over half of all pharmaceutical sales are of products that started in little companies. They're used to buying innovation, they rely on it, they've got an unprecedented amount of cash on their balance sheet, $175 billion today, to buy product. So, to be successful, the first thing, don't do what the industry's done for the last several decades, which is concentrate on incremental improvements in established categories. The system doesn't need another NSAID. The system needs an approach that can make a difference to where it's spending all its money, which is the sequelae of incurable diseases. There is no end of important targets. Science every day is giving us new opportunities to change how this game is played. So you need products that are changing how you treat patients in a meaningful way. There are lots of opportunities. As I say, getting an approved product means anyone chasing you has to spend $1.5 billion and take 10 to 15 years to do it. So this is a wonderful property of the pharma business. And, you know, I'd say to folks in the device business, diagnostics, think about ways to make your product more like a drug in terms of intersection of the approval process, your IP, and the barriers to entry. Today, you've got to be cost effective, so we're considered investable if you can get to a proof of principle, double-blind, controlled study, let's say, for under 5 years and under $50 million. Increasingly, pharmacoeconomic discussions, arguments are part of the approval process. This is already mandated in Europe. And in the FDA, you know, this becomes part of the argument. They want to know, is this new product going to save the system money or cost it money? And they may not let you sell it if they think it's going to cost them money. Finally, as they say in London on the underground, mind the gap. So the venture capital or venture philanthropy gap is something that requires a lot of attention in how you proceed to develop data and de-risk a program, spending as little time and money as possible. Sort of the sum of my comments, and happy to take questions in our panel discussion.
Thank you, Hal. There's going to be a Q&A period after the three presentations, so I'm sure that questions will be raised and we'll be happy to respond to them. Jonathan?
Hello, everybody. It's great to be back at Princeton. I graduated here 26 years ago and proved that you can become a venture capitalist with a master's in public administration. And you can actually make the world a vastly better place by using venture capital to accomplish the goals that you set out to go to the Woodrow Wilson School in the very beginning. So I'm going to talk just for 10 minutes. I'm going to talk about the medical device business, and then again we'll try to answer specific questions in the Q&A. So since leaving Princeton, I ultimately ended up managing this firm. It's one of the larger venture capital firms based in Boston. We say that we're inside the MIT Harvard Innovation Supercluster because it is a remarkable concentration of 4 medical schools, about 50 pharmaceutical companies, 300 biotechnology companies, 400 medical device companies, 100 venture capitalists, thousands of angel investors, as well as Fidelity. So we have raised about 5 funds, totaling $1 billion. We've made 147 investments in the life sciences. Of those, about 50% have been the kind of drug things that Hal talked about. About 25% have been medical devices. Some have been in the area of instrumentation. So for those of you who've been following the genomics I won't call them wars, but the genomics markets and how quickly now we can sequence a human genome. That's something that my company was very involved in developing. And more recently, we've started to take biotechnology out of regulated markets in healthcare and into differently regulated markets in energy or electronics. Same technologies, just different apps. And we do this all over the world, and increasingly we'll be doing it in Asia. We have a pretty active medical device portfolio today. I put this up there just to give you some sense of what we're doing. If you go through that, you'll see mitral valve repair, AFib, percutaneous catheter, ischemic stroke, peripheral arterial disease. So about 50% of all the things that venture capitalists buy in or finance in the medical device sector is in the field of cardiology. There were essentially two reasons for this. A lot of people had heart disease. Secondly, the heart system is basically a series of pumps and valves. If you're going to develop mechanical approaches to go inside and fix it, it's easier to fix something that's essentially a series of pumps and valves and tubes. A liver or a brain or a kidney turns out to be a lot more complicated. But a heart and a circulatory system is pumps and valves, and you can go in and repair it. So we've got some other things up there as well. And as you can see, it's very popular right now for venture capitalists to focus on diagnostic technologies for a whole set of reasons that have to do with believing that they'll be more easily approved than some of these other more exotic treatments that take less money to develop. And there's some belief that the folks in Washington will be more friendly towards diagnostics than they will be towards therapeutics right now. Generally, what we're trying to do when we do this is we're trying to take a procedure that you used to have to go into the hospital and spend a couple of weeks being cut open, opened up, have something done to you, so you back up, wait until you're healed, send you home. Almost everything today is done with what's known as an interventional procedure. An interventional procedure is when they open up a little cut about 1 inch thick in your leg, they snake a catheter into your artery, and they go anywhere they want in the body, into your heart, into your brain, into various organs through your circulatory system, and they work on you from the inside. The advantage of that is that you have only one little cut about 1 inch long on your leg, and you can go home that same day. So many of the people who you may know in your parents' circles who are having heart attacks or having treatments for heart disease, it's just when they got the Princeton tuition bill, they sort of had a little. But they in fact now can go be treated in a hospital and come out the same day. So that's been the big revolution there. So I'm just going to fly through a bunch of trends that are impacting startups and investment in the medical device area. So the first is, just like in the pharmaceutical business, big companies, Boston Scientific, St. Jude, Medtronic, J&J, these kinds of companies absolutely depend upon little companies for all of their new product introductions. The kinds of pharmaceutical companies that Hal was talking about spend about 17% of their revenues on R&D. Boston Scientific spends about 5% of its revenues on R&D, and it buys our little companies to keep its product pipeline going. Right now, the biggest issue that we have is with the FDA. As Hal sort of mentioned, casually the focus has been on safety and not approving things. And what they have really done that has been so difficult for people who make investments. Remember, Hal told you that you make these investments, it involves tens of millions of dollars over 5 to 8 years to 10 years in terms of time horizons. So if you think about that, if you're going to commit that kind of capital, you want the goal that you're shooting for at the end to be very fixed and not move. The worst thing you want to do is commit $25 million of somebody else's money. Remember, this is not my money. This is the pension fund of the teacher or the policeman or the firefighter. Their money. $25 million in, and some government bureaucrat says, I feel like changing the rules. And that $25 million in those 5 years you just spent just went down the tubes. So when you perceive that there is a high risk or a high level of uncertainty that someone is going to change the rules, and in fact, when they make the uncertainty certain and they announce they're going to change the rules, but they don't tell you what the rules are, you stop investing. So at least one of the reasons why this country has a significant job creation issue right now is there are, at least in our field, hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars that would be eager to invest in these companies that cannot. It is essentially frozen by result of regulatory policy. After you get through the FDA, you run a 3-year gauntlet with somebody called the CMS. The way it works in our country, if you want to get paid for your procedure or your product, typically the government sets the price because they pay, in the old days, about 40% of all the payments that went into doctors or product manufacturers. After this new healthcare reform, that number is obviously going to be much higher. So what the government decides to pay you is pretty much what Blue Cross Blue Shield or United Health or the other companies all decide to pay you. So if CMS has announced we're not going to pay you much anymore, that also has a very chilling impact on investment. The Reform Bill impact was neutral to slightly positive. As Hal said, they basically said nobody can deny you coverage. Insurance companies have to pay for everything and hospitals have to accept you. So most capitalists concluded that the amount of spending on healthcare would go up because there's absolutely nothing in that bill immediately to control the amount of spending other than more people have to be covered for everything. There is this little thing in there called comparative effectiveness where the government's going to spend $1 billion to try to compare when there are multiple treatments in a particular disease, which one is more effective, but they're still fighting over the rules by which they're going to make those judgments. As a result, the capital markets are very unenthusiastic about this sector. I'll show you a graphic why. IPO markets are basically awful. So Hal told you about 50-yard lines or 80-yard lines. Right now, we're mostly not even in the stadium. So we don't have a ball and a game to play with. So the success, particularly and especially in the medical device business, means you leave the country. My firm does not start a new company to develop a medical device for Americans. I'm going to show you a product that saves at least 10,000 lives a year. It is not available for Americans. So one of the things, if you want to start a company in the medical device business, you'd better really like German food because you're going to spend a lot of time over there in Frankfurt. So basically, the strategy for medical devices, you do your first in man outside of the United States. You get a CE mark, which is the equivalent of FDA approval for Europe. You build credibility with your KOLs, which are key opinion leaders. And then you sell to a big company like Boston Scientific, and they will come in here if they perceive that reimbursement is present and stable, and they can go on a 3 to 5 year campaign to get approval to sell their product in this country. So you need a lot of money, time, and expertise required to get reimbursement in this country, which is why small companies almost always don't try anymore. It is still a sector, I don't know if this is even legible up here, but the basic point is that people are still making Series A investments in medical technology companies. It's not a whole lot of money, just 98 million this year, but it is a category that's big enough that the National Venture Capital Association sort of breaks it out and tracks it. And you can see that compared to all these other categories up here, medical devices is actually one of the larger categories that people still invest in, which tells you how we feel about the rest of the things we can invest in these days. MedTech IPOs are still rare, so remember this is what Hal tells you we live off of. When we're successful, we're supposed to be able to take these things public. So look, you know, they just showed you that 18 new companies got started this year. If every year we just started 18 companies and every year we just exited 3, that's sort of a recipe for disaster in our industry. So this is a horrible looking curve to most venture capitalists, and it tells them that if this continues, they're going to actually have to find a different profession, or, and this is what you are starting to see happen, is that the capital markets of other countries. So I've now brought companies public in England, in Japan, in Switzerland. We're thinking about doing one on the Tel Aviv exchange, and we're very seriously investigating the Korean stock exchange, because actually these stock exchanges are now becoming friendlier to little companies than our own American NASDAQ, which is heavily regulated and quite expensive. The M&A market, you can see here 93 companies, 126 companies. So this is the dynamic that I told you. Lots of little companies getting started, getting their products to some level, someplace in Europe, and then ultimately getting acquired by big guys. Here are some transactions that occurred pretty recently. These are all out of the cardiovascular space. And you can see one product on the market in Europe, one product on the market in Europe, 2 products in clinical trials in Europe. None of these companies, and they were bought for, where's the number? Here it is down here, 325, 456, 850. Not one of them had a single patient in the United States for these innovative new therapies. These were companies that were all built by American founders with American money and American management in Europe from an American base and bought by American big companies. So this is my last fun example. So you're looking at the first man ever to be saved with a percutaneous valve. So I told you that the cardiovascular system is the system of pumps and valves. So what used to happen is, does anyone have an idea of when in the year 2010 each of you had your millionth heartbeat? What day of the year? It was January 10th. So 10 days into the year, you've already had 1 million clicks on that heart pump of yours. So imagine if you're an 85-year-old woman, sort of do the math on how many times her heart valve has opened and closed. So as these aging populations occur that Hal talked to you about, one of the things that happen is otherwise pretty healthy people start wearing down, slowing down because their heart valves just don't pump out as much blood as they used to. So the only thing you can do for these people is it's actually pretty easy to put in a spare valve. We use pigs. Pigs actually have hearts that are a lot like humans, or we could say humans are a lot like pigs. But you also can make an artificial valve. They both work really well. And what they do to your mom still in the United States, not in Europe, is they cut her open and they open up her chest. They crack her rib cage. They slice open the pericardium, which is the sac that surrounds her heart. They stop the heart. They put the heart on a heart-lung machine. And then they go in and they slice open the heart, they core out the valve, they put in a new valve, and then they reverse all of that. Mom spends about 2 weeks in the hospital where her biggest risk is not the fact that her heart is going, it's that she's going to die from a bug she catches in the hospital. So this has been replaced with a device that is it's inserted through the little hole in the leg. It goes up into your heart. The catheter goes into the valve. A balloon pushes out the valve. There's a stent there, which you can see here. The leaflets of the valve lock into that stent. Nothing could move that stent after that. There's a little heart valve inside there. It's not as big as the original. If you're an 85-year-old mom, it's perfectly wonderful. She's out of the hospital the same day. This guy was about 1 hour away from death. He went on to live for a whole nother year despite having all kinds of things wrong with him. So what's sort of interesting about this story is that when it says October 1999, PVT was founded. So there was a doctor, there was my partner, and there was one other venture capitalist. There was the Four Seasons Bar in New York, and there was an idea. And this product came out of that cocktail. And that's the power of what we do. That 3 people sitting there can say, you know, there's got to be a better way. They can draw it up on a napkin, and if they have sort of the right way of putting it together, you can actually make all of this happen. So what we did is we went from the napkin. We started a company in December 2000. This was actually a product was built and developed in Israel, which is a great place to do these things. Besides Oxford, 2 years after funding it, we brought in both Boston Scientific and Medtronic. Shortly after that, we had our first in man. We published it in 2003. We sold the company after only 7 patients for $150 million. So this product was, let's see, did they show you when they got into the market in Europe? They got into the market in 2007. They estimate that Edwards, which is a large US company, will finally be able to get the FDA to approve this product sometime in 2012 or 2013. So this isn't a little venture capital-backed company. And the company that bought it has grown their market cap up to $7.7 billion just on the strength of this one product, because it's estimated it will do about $3 billion a year in the United States when it's finally approved, because it will take a bunch of people who would otherwise die and allow them to live. So finishing up, Last words, acquisition of knowledge and innovation are absolutely accelerating in the world. All of you students have it way easier than Hal and I ever did. Interest in entrepreneurship is higher than ever, not just here in the United States, but all over the world. Young people are fired up about this. They have a special focus on building companies with a social mission. I get lots and lots of students who want to start a company, and the way they want to run the company and what they want the company to do has to have some sort of social mission. It's one of the most powerful forces that young people are driving in the world today. The integration of the smartphone with medical technology will be huge, not in America, but everything that happens in a village in India, everything happens through a phone, everything. Everything that happens in a rural village in Asia or China or Africa, it's going to happen through the phone. And that marriage of the phone and medical technology will be something that students can write killer apps for all day long. Diagnostics will be very active. I don't have time to tell you why it's going to be really, really hard to succeed. These interventional things that I told you are going to grow, and the next place we're going to go is the brain. HIT is an excellent place to start a company if you're a Princeton student, because what's happened is that now, in the last 2 years, there's been a standard electronic medical record that's been developed for the entire country. Every EMR has to talk to every other EMR. So think about it in terms of the iPad or the iPhone. You now have, every hospital has an iPhone, and if you develop an app that runs on that electronic medical record, you have sort of a built-in user base to work with. So there's going to be a ton of apps developed in HIT that will probably run on iPhones. And success is always going to require global strategy and relationships. Thank you.
I feel very fortunate that I get to follow Hal and Jonathan, because they did a great setup for me, because you can imagine what I'm going to speak about as sort of a case study in building a company in the area of cellular medicine, and I have every pitfall that I think has been described I have hit, and have attempted to navigate a relatively difficult, let me just make sure, right there, a difficult environment that I think both Hal and Jonathan spoke about. The game has changed. From the time I began my company in 1998 till today, the game around building a business in biomedical technology is vastly different than just a little more than a decade ago. Nonetheless, I've never been more excited as someone who began my professional life as a neurosurgeon treating head and spinal cord injury patients in New York City. I think I hold the record for treating more gunshot wounds to the head than anybody in New York. To today, every day I go to work in this venture is exciting. But we had very humble beginnings. The origins of Celgene Cellular Therapeutics, which is the world's largest stem cell therapy company, came from my garage. I took a medical freezer and some other equipment and began to collect the leftovers of birth in the middle of the wee hours of the morning. I think people thought that I had lost my mind. In fact, I can tell you that many of my colleagues at Cornell were convinced of that. And then where we are today is we occupy some of the largest research and development space in New Jersey, aimed in developing cellular products, and we've got facilities around the world who are working in one way or another to advance these products into the clinic. And I can tell you that for me at least, the origins really began when I was frustrated with what I had to bring to patients after these serious neurologic injuries. You know, we got really good at keeping people with bad head and spinal cord injuries alive, but we couldn't fix what was damaged. So at the emergence and the discovery of stem cells, it appeared this might serve as a platform to change the way those diseases were treated and potentially alter the natural history of those types of, we thought, irreparable injuries. People say necessity is the mother of invention. That is absolutely true in this case as well. But behind all of this, we had to have the right tools to deliver on this concept that you could take a living biologic entity and turn it into a medicine. It's something that a doctor could write an order for and deliver as a therapeutic product. And when you consider that it's a 15-year process to get something from the laboratory to the bedside and then to approval, and the amount of money that is required to do this with known entities like chemicals and small molecules, we embarked on this when there was no roadmap for delivering a cellular product to the marketplace. So you had to have a lot of willingness to potentially fail and have to do some mid-course corrections to get yourself back on track. So risk tolerance was a very, very big part of this. But with the discovery of stem cells, we recognized that the biology was so fundamentally powerful, and it was already, at the time when I started my company, a useful research tool, that the promise was so tremendous, both in transforming what we could offer patients and also in how lucrative this was commercially, that we decided that we were going to give this a shot. And I left a faculty position at Cornell Medical School to start this company, and I've never looked back, and have been happier than I've ever been, and found an angle. Okay? And every entrepreneur will tell you that it's important to find an angle. The angle for us was that the sourcing of cells to turn into medicine was controversial. Remember, a decade ago, the discovery of cells that had stem-like potential, the ability to, as they divide, differentiate and mature into the various specialized cell types of the body, we knew back then that deriving these from embryos posed a dilemma, an ethical dilemma for practitioners and for scientists, and clearly this would represent a potential commercial dilemma. Would people be willing to use a product that compromised or put in question some of their fundamental moral or ethical beliefs? We saw that as opportunity. We need the right tools to build a company like this, and one thing which I want to bring up is that when you're out there begging for money, when I'm talking to guys like Hal and Jonathan and telling them about this great idea and trying to get money, credentials help. Okay, your pedigree is important. And not to be disrespectful, but I have guys coming into with some very interesting scientific concepts that might improve what I do. I pay a little bit more attention to someone who comes from a rigorous background than from someone who comes from a less rigorous background. And I look also at their track record. Human capital plays an enormously important role in building a business. So I look at what someone has done, and it doesn't have to be in this particular area, but just in their life's history. What have they done? What have they accomplished? Can they navigate through failure? I personally embrace failure, probably because I'm so good at it. But it's very important to be able to make a lemonade out of lemons. And you have to have passion of purpose, okay? In my business, I was convinced that if this worked, it would transform medicine. I'd be able to change the natural history of the diseases that I was so frustrated dealing with as a surgeon. And the value proposition had to be high. For me to go and beg for money from investors, I had to convince them that the payoff would be tremendous. Now, the challenges behind all this for someone like myself were, I had to figure out this whole area of garage entrepreneurship. Okay, I had to build something tangible in a very confined environment in order to go and tell the story I needed to raise the capital to build in baby steps, if you will, to a point that I had a legitimate prospect of having a successful small business. It required a bold plan. It required us to think very abstractly. Again, I mentioned that in this particular field there was no precedent, there was no roadmap. We had to think several decades ahead of the game to figure out whether or not this particular approach would be a viable one in biomedicine. In my hands, one of the ways that I attempted to do this was to manage the risk in this business by building a sustainable service operation that generated revenue, and that revenue engine helped me build my research and development capabilities so that we could have a successful play at creating a therapeutic platform. And it was very clear at the time that we were in need of a breakthrough. We had to have a discovery in the laboratory which validated the concept that cells could be turned into medicines and that these products would be accepted by the clinical and the public communities. And then in terms of tactics, I think that both Hal and Jonathan have told you that since the game has changed, the conventional exits for businesses like this, it was cloudy. I didn't know where we'd be able to go. The prospects of a public offering to build a company with public money from the exchange seemed to grow less and less likely. And so it was very important to look at how I could build something that was valuable to a bigger company. And that actually is the strategy we pursued. And where we are today could not have happened had we not been acquired and merged into a successful larger company. Now, I'm a big believer that you have to ride the wave. This means you need to sort of understand the momentum in your field and utilize that to help you make many of the decisions on who you're going to approach, how you're going to approach them, and how you're going to tell your story. And I like this picture, not because I don't know how to surf, but I like the wake of that surfboard. It looks like our logo. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about the platform. So what we did, which was unusual, is at a time when everybody thought that in order to have cells that could be used as medicine, you were going to have to compromise or sacrifice a human life in the form of an embryo. And what we decided was, we were going to go and explore the placenta, the leftovers of full-term healthy pregnancies. These things are thrown away, so in a lot of ways we can be considered a green technology. Actually, it's funny, I actually did the analysis. There is a significant carbon footprint to just the disposal and destruction and elimination of placentas after birth. So what we're doing will make Al Gore very, very happy. But this material, the placenta, is a remarkable organ. It actually, when I began to explore this, I was disturbed at the fact that we're the only species that doesn't recycle this material. It is so remarkably valuable. It has a very, very unique biologically, fundamental biologic advantage over other sources of stem cells because the placenta is nature's professional allograft, professional immunomodulator. So the concept of putting cells from one person into another, a decade ago, we didn't know if we'd have to match every patient, every donor to every recipient. That's what happens in organ transplantation, and I can tell you, if that was the case with cellular medicine would die a nasty death. We had to be able to procure this material under very rigorous standards because the one message you should take home from all of this is that we need to reform the FDA because the regulatory environment is so hostile for businesses, and especially for those who are developing breakthrough technologies, that we had to build a very rigorous system of procurement that we could harvest material from consented donors that met very high standards to mitigate any risk of transmitting infectious disease. And that's one of the things that had to be built early. I mentioned to you that I built this service business of banking stem cells up front. That platform got us really, really good at building that procurement apparatus. And then from the placenta, what we learned is that there's a tremendous number of cells. The placenta is about a kilogram-sized organ. Compare that to an embryo at the time that you could recover stem cells from that small biologic moiety. A kilogram versus about 16 or 20 cells you could harvest from an embryo. A placenta yields many hundreds of billions of cells, all of which have stem and progenitor-like behavior. The cells are very stable. They can be expanded in culture, which means you can take this to a pharmaceutical-like model of manufacturing. And the use of these cells today, we recognize that they exert their effects in very different ways than originally thought. And I put this up just to illustrate something. When I got into this field, we all thought that stem cells were going to be like biological plaster. Every time there was a hole someplace, a hole in the heart, a hole in the liver, we were going to take these cells, stick them in there, and they were going to replace what was lost. That's actually not what they do. Turns out that stem cells actually act by elaborating a variety of important chemical signaling factors which actually turn on endogenous repair and regeneration mechanisms. They modulate the immune system, they support endogenous repair, and they actually suppress some of the negative effects that occur with injury, the process of fibrosis. And because of that, this broad range of activities can be applied to inflammatory disease, to cancer, treatment of degenerative disease, et cetera. So very, very wide area to operate in. So I'm going to speak very quickly about our particular cell platform. Placental derived adherent cells, PDACs, were the first category of cells we derived and productized. They have a variety of biological activities. The ones that were most important to us were the immunosuppressant behaviors. In order to get to the next step, we had to create a model of manufacturing, and this is what we call the pharmaceuticalization of placentally derived cells. And consider this, that pharmaceuticals, you figure out a molecule that has a certain activity, and then you mass produce that molecule. And then the economics of your product can fit into this highly confined economic system in healthcare. Well, we had to do that with cells also. And unlike any other source of stem or progenitor cells, the placenta is a dramatically useful material for propagating your end product. From a single placenta, we can produce hundreds of thousands of doses, perhaps even millions. And that means that we can ultimately have a product which will have economics comparable to biologic agents or to pharmaceuticals. How many biologists here, immunologists? Okay? All right, so you guys, I stuck this in here for you. All right. So these products have to have an interesting and useful mechanism of action. And what we've learned over the last 10 years is that the specific immunosuppressant behavior of placental cells is actually something that is, I believe, at the core of mammalian evolution. You know, the placenta is a foreign material that exists in a maternal system for 9 months and isn't rejected. Pretty remarkable. I couldn't put a liver from one individual into another without it being rejected. But the placenta evades immune detection and destruction. And it does so in a very, very specific way. And there's no better example of this activity than in surrogate pregnancy, where a maternal host to a foreign, completely unrelated fetus never results in either rejection of the fetus or an immunocompromised state in the mother. So that remarkable bioactivity is something that we decided to explore as the first wedge, if you will, for us to get a product into the clinic. And among the many interesting things these cells do is they actually control the fundamental immunologic signaling events associated with the inflammatory and immune rejection response. And that's listed here. In addition, they secrete all of these important factors that turn on our own natural ability to repair. So just to kind of put this into perspective, using the science that we derived in our laboratories and the manufactured product we produced in our manufacturing facility and taking it into the clinic, we first decided to see if this worked in a fairly common and pretty nasty autoimmune disease called Crohn's disease. This is when your immune system actually attacks your own gastrointestinal tract and causes basically wreaks such havoc that in some cases patients will die from this disease. It is a very, very debilitating illness. And it has some very clear clinical endpoints to follow that we found useful in proving, in essence, a proof of concept that this worked clinically. And the primary objective was to demonstrate safety, and the secondary objective was to show that it worked. And we did this with two very, very different doses of cells. And I simply want to show you that, wow, you can go from a crazy idea to actually treating patients and making a difference. So in this disease population, the CDAI is the Crohn's Disease Activity Index. That's how bad the disease is. 150 is considered normal. 300 is considered moderate to severe disease. These are patients who have such bad inflammatory disease of their digestive system that they're having 20 or 30 bowel movements a day. They're losing blood in their gastrointestinal system. They suffer from chronic malnutrition, etc. And what we saw was that just 2 administrations of these cells in the first week of the trial resulted in 4 weeks in essentially remission. We put virtually all patients into a positive clinical response. But what blew our minds was that we treated these patients in the first week. These patients had a response 6 months and actually a year later. So the concept that we could alter the natural history of disease actually held up in this program. And in a population, and these are, the numbers don't really mean anything, but these numbers are better than double what has ever been reported in a clinical trial using a biologic agent or a small molecule or whatnot. And in a patient population that was even sicker than this, it took them longer, but they also had profound responses that lasted a long time. So, the summary of all this, and I don't want to belabor this is not important, but the concept that we could take a living product, use a fundamental biologic activity that is central to how a placenta can exist in a maternal system, and then put it into a useful tool for treating a category of disease like autoimmune disease, has put us in a position now that we're exploiting this product in things like multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, stroke, sarcoidosis, etc. And the potential for this product is vast. So when our investors look at this, and now as part of a large public company, when Wall Street looks at this, they can get excited because every one of these diseases, and category diseases and specific disorders, every one of them is a multi-billion-dollar opportunity. So to wrap it up, what I want to leave you with is this. So it's really obvious that a big idea like turning cells into medicine takes a lot of time. I think that Hal and Jonathan told you that the traditional course is more than a decade from discovery to the clinic, and usually 15 years or so before you get approvals. You got to have a patient investor and also a patient bunch of employees who are willing to devote literally a professional lifetime at pursuing this end game. Takes a lot of money too. $1.5 billion to get a product approved. The nice thing about cells is that with this platform I've described to you, approval in one disease like Crohn's disease, because the same product works in lots of different disorders, may allow us to get a better return on investment than we could from a small molecule. Because it's going to work in Crohn's, it's likely to work in ulcerative colitis, it's likely to work in rheumatoid arthritis, etc. Because the fundamental biology is so similar. Very, very important as an entrepreneur, and I hope that many of you take the remarkable skills you get here at Princeton out and build your own companies. The quality of your plan is crucial. Never compromise on that. Keep your eyes open to what's happening in the field around you. There's nothing worse than spending 10 years chasing a treatment for Crohn's disease just to be knocked out of the way by some other technology that someone else is working on. Failure is an opportunity, in my mind, for course correction and a tremendous learning opportunity, and also consider that there's always more than one way to skin a cat. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. I'm going to invite all 3 speakers to sit at the table and open this up to Q&A. Fascinating presentations, raised a lot of questions. Who wants to start it off? Yeah, Nikhil?
Hi, thanks so much. That was awesome. I'm just wondering what you guys think about third-generation sequencing, sort of the single molecule and nanopore technologies that are just hitting the market, and what you think the impact of those technologies will be on diagnostics, on drug discovery, on this world of personalized medical treatment that we're hoping to get to.
Who wants to take it?
I'll start. They probably all have something to say. So, yeah, there's no question that sequencing has been getting better, faster, cheaper, steadily since the days of the first human genome. Jonathan and I actually had something to do with Craig Venter's first company, and there the opportunity was just to get one person's genome, and that could be done by getting every applied biosystem sequencer that was being manufactured and just setting them to work, and we knew it would happen at a huge cost, but that was seen as, you know, the first big glimpse. The opportunities to apply that go up exponentially as the cost comes down. We haven't gotten to the threshold to bring it into the physician's office setting yet, but it's clearly going there. And, you know, someday this will have a profound change on how we manage people, how we identify their diseases, how we treat them, how we prescribe for them. You know, the pundits will tell you we might come to an environment someday where you know, everybody gets their own individualized therapy. That's probably a little over the top, but it leads there.
So I guess all I would add to that is that we track what we call the cost of a single unit, single base pair, what it costs to produce that. We're the folks who did not just human genome, but also Celexa. So we really do watch that very carefully. And what I would tell you right now, I suppose you're referring to the PacBios and those kinds of companies. And I guess our view is that the people who have these Celexa machines right now in these big sequencing centers have already driven the cost down to less than $10,000 a genome. And the number of genomes is exploding. They'll get it down to under 1,000 in 2 years. And so that's without any new investment, any new products or technology coming onto the market. At that point, you're kind of drinking from a fire hose. You've got all this information coming down, and there will be a period where you just need to sort of sort it out and find the killer apps. So our particular view is that PacBio is certainly, as an idea, is, you know, outstanding, way too much money, way too high a price, but the translation of all of that, what Hal talked about, will go through kind of a rough period, mostly because right now the medical system is getting all this information, but it has to correlate it with what happens in people's clinical outcomes. It's just going to take a while to crunch all of that, and I think it's going to be 3 to 5 years before you really see a difference. And then to echo something that we've kept saying here, the biggest single obstacle to personalized medicine in the United States is the FDA. And it's just absolutely very, very, very difficult right now to get them to make it possible to do one of these so-called companion diagnostics with the, and it's not because they don't want it, they really do want it. So if you ask them, they'd say, of course we want that. But their view of what industry should have to do in order to prove that something is safe and efficacious and be offered at a very low price, if not free of charge to the rest of the world, that whole piece is really stuck right now in Washington, and we're not talking to each other very effectively.
Do you want to add anything?
Let me simply say this. As this entire sphere of genotyping technology matures, one of the greatest opportunities that I see, and what I'm excited about, is dealing with our friends at the FDA by giving them ironclad information to follow that I think will reduce the need for 3,000, 5,000, 10,000 patient clinical trials. So it should help control the costs of bringing products to the marketplace. But I also think that, you know, you saw 60,000 chemicals and products enter the development process, and then one comes out as an approved product. That doesn't mean that 60,000 chemicals were ineffective. What it means is that the trial design didn't absolutely tease out where the activity was and in which population of patients, which select set of genetic traits could be matched to that therapeutic product. So there's going to be an entire world available where using these tools will allow you to go back, I think, and pull some of these products out of the off the shelves and show, you know what, it failed the clinical trial, didn't show efficacy in that large population, but if you look at these sets of genetic traits and you now focus, I think you could actually get approvals on as little as 30 patients. And Celgene has done that. Well, by identifying a specific genetic characteristic where 100% of our patients who got our product responded, you can compel the agency to get approvals on that number of patients. That's where I think there's a lot of excitement.
Can I just add one more
Yeah.
quick point on genomics, which is a point for Princeton? So personalized genomics are coming, and the biggest impediment for them being deployed and implemented is not their existence, it's processing the data. And this becomes a huge computational problem, and institutions like this one can chew on that. So,
With big computers.
Question?
You talked about the FDA, one almost gets the impression it was infiltrated by the Taliban. But there has to be another explanation. They're not just born misanthropes. There's something that makes these bureaucrats behave this way. Part of it could be the general risk averseness of Americans.
Trial lawyers.
Who've over the years become ever more squeamish about a lot of things. But there also is something in the bureaucracy that makes these people so gun-shy and so excessively safety conscious. And what is it in other culture, Jonathan, you spent time in Germany, that their equivalent of the FDA doesn't behave that way?
Actually, this has been a somewhat recent, at least I can't recall in 28 years when I've seen three people be so extreme in their views of the agency. And it really is a more recent phenomenon. And the more recent phenomenon had to do with a sense in the current administration that if you had actually ever worked for a for-profit business, it was what working for the Communist Party used to be in the 50s. And so there's been a purge. People actually do use the word Stalinist purge of people in the agency. And the agency also uses, for a lot of its work, what are called advisory boards. So what they used to do is or they still do, they go out and they get all of the leading experts in a particular area to advise them on whether they should approve a particular therapy. But they decided 2 years ago that if anybody had ever worked for industry, they were disqualified, they were tainted somehow because they actually knew how a drug was developed. So they've been banned from participation in these advisory boards. So you now have, I have companies coming back from meetings with the FDA and they said, well, it was sort of interesting. We were talking to this guy from, a 28-year-old freshly minted professor at the University of Nebraska. He was the only person they could find that didn't have this background. Now, given the sort of safety consciousness that's out there, if you have no experience, you've never done it before, and someone comes in and says, this is risky, you say no. And so it's really happened has been, I always had very good relationships with the FDA in past administrations, is that somehow the sense that we're all on the same side has been lost. And there is a tremendous sense of opposing teams right now. And all of these people who went to school to become reviewers at the FDA or to develop drugs all started to go to medical school for the same reason, is to make people better. And they have the same attitudes, but they're really at cross purposes in these last 2 or 3 years.
So I'd like to echo what Jonathan said, because it's right on. It's just a function of risk-reward, and the rewards, if you're at the FDA, are really only around saying no. The risks are all in saying yes. I mean, the last big example I can think of, I'm sure we can think of others, Merck's Vioxx. Again, here's a product that had a tremendous amount poured into it. It was an incremental improvement in the NSAID market. Could have been benefit to a certain class of patient. You can only see the kind of dangers that exist in improving a molecule like that when it's out in the population. So when it got out, as they say in phase 4, as a marketed product tracked, you began to see anomalies which the FDA was criticized for ever having let that go to market. So the culture has shifted. I mean, it's full of smart people, and we've had good colleagues who've gone to work in this environment. But as Jonathan said, it has really evolved today into a very adversarial situation. They do not see themselves in any way working with the industry to get there. And I can tell you about a recent meeting I had down with one of my companies, and just as an eye-opener, they dragged me along. We met with the pulmonary division for the first time on an ophthalmic application. This had never happened before, but if you put something in the eye, it can go down the nasal lacrimal duct and affect the upper nasal tract. So we had a product that not only gave great relief to eyes, but solved all these upper nasal systems. And that's the turf of a different division. So the first part of the story is you got a new cast of 30 people trooping into the room who've never met us before. A tremendous sense of hostility. And by the way, there are several doctors, but there are many other kinds of professionals on this team. Statisticians, form fillers, I mean, people of all kinds of backgrounds. It is a very formal kind of kabuki theater dance. And without taking you through the whole thing, the biggest concern this group had in thinking about this indication in their turf for an ophthalmic product was, gee, if this is successful, the consumer might be inclined to take things they normally stick up their nose and squirt them in their eye. And you know, there's not enough data in the world to ever deal with a problem like this. So it has become a very dysfunctional kind of relationship.
Next question. Yeah, in the rear.
Yeah, I had just one or two questions, more at Bob, but I think the rest of the panel could address it. Just curious, in your process of building this company, you say there's interim failures and things that you had to change. What were the sort of biggest, scariest things that you had to change? And in particular, I'm thinking about the discovery of, say, induced stem cells. Did that change your strategy? Does that change your strategy now? Is that something scary? What are those things that you had to deal with? And the other panelists, have you seen companies had to completely change their strategies or midway, or how do they deal with that kind of problem? I'm curious about stories.
Well, I think that's a fabulous question. I mean, the reality is there's been very little that's occurred within the field of stem cell biology that caused us to have to make an important strategic shift. But actually, without a doubt, a change in the posture of the regulatory environment has clearly changed the way we've done many, many things. So let me try and illustrate this if I can. So ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, is a horrible disease. Basically, your lower motor neurons, the things that connect your spinal cord to your body, to your brain, start to fail, and patients literally become disconnected from their brain and die horrible deaths, generally respiratory deaths. It's slow, it's agonizing, it occurs in young people. It's a horrible thing to watch. The concept early on that you might be able to arrest progress in this disease by delivering cells that might turn off a potential immune mediator that had a negative effect, or turn up trophic factors that allowed these cells to repair, led us 10 years ago to go to the FDA and say, listen, there's some animal research that suggests some promise. This is a horrible disease, no known alternative mode of therapy. We want to treat these patients, give them infusions of stem cells. Can we deliver cells, for example, cells derived from umbilical cord blood? Is there a problem with that? What would we have to do? And the agency back then said, well, you know what? As long as the cells are produced to the same standards that you would use to do a bone marrow transplant, I guess a doctor can prescribe it. So back in 2000, 2001, we treated about 40 ALS patients with extremely high doses of umbilical cord blood stem cells. And had I not seen this with my own eyes, I would have thought that it was absolute fiction. But we saw in 40 patients, every single patient had some neurologic benefit from these ultra-high doses of stem cells. However, the results and the responses were short-lived. Several weeks, perhaps a month and a half, and then patients went back to their neurologic status. But nonetheless, very, very exciting. I saw a flaccidly paralyzed individual 72 hours after his infusion stand up and weight bear, something he couldn't do for many months prior to the treatment. The excitement led people to start talking about this on the internet, And the FDA caught wind of this, and their first concern was, well, you've developed this, you've used this in an application that's not the specific use of cord blood stem cells, which is rebuilding your bone marrow, your blood and immune system. So we have to halt this, and because we're concerned that someone might get this and you'll alter their bone marrow. Well, it doesn't really matter in that population because they're going to die of their neurologic disease. But the agency's absolute risk-averse behavior has led to a 10-year delay in treating patients. And I'm happy to say we've begun treating patients again with stem cells, and it looks like the stuff works.
One each, right? Or something
Yeah.
like that. One each.
Yeah, exactly.
One patient each.
One patient each. And so consider that in this 10-year interval, 50,000 people in this country have died of ALS. So I'm hopeful that, and I didn't get to answer the question before, but I want to just add this, maybe to be a little inflammatory, if I might be. The fact is that the FDA responds to Congress, who respond to the trends in trial law, and so when you have a tremendous financial incentive for an attorney to file lawsuits every time a patient doesn't get the absolute perfect outcome that they expect, this has a snowballing effect, which leads to an agency that I think has gone haywire. And there are some cases where therapeutic products need a degree of latitude and a more liberal approach. And we're hoping that there may be an administration in the future that looks to reform the agency.
Let's come back to your question, though, because it really is a great question. And the fact is that I think all of us, certainly Hal and I, you could pick almost any company in any area, and the ones that worked, the guys that made us a lot of money, that what they made us money on wasn't anything like what they started out with when we gave them the money. And the really, what the thrill of being an entrepreneur, it seems to be, is for small groups of you, usually a management team is about 4 people, to sort of work collectively to overcome these tremendous obstacles. We always say that these little companies have 2 or 3 near-death experiences along the way to success, and they really do, because it could be a regulatory thing, it could be your product doesn't work, it could be that a key member of your team got sick or had an accident.
Or gets recruited.
It could be you're on your way to the key meeting in Europe to meet with Sanofi, and there's a freaking volcano, and all traffic is halted to Europe for a month. And you have to go back to your venture capitalist and tell Hal that you just blew the meeting because of a volcano. Like the dog ate your homework, right? So when you're a little company, remember, you're living from hand to mouth. You're not a cash flow positive company. If Merck, if something bad happens tomorrow, they'll still have another wad of cash rolling through the door. You're not. So it's that intensity of experience when 3 or 4 people who are completely committed to each other in that foxhole, are sitting there at midnight going, oh my goodness, what are we going to do now? And then they, one calls at 3 in the morning and says, I just had this idea. That's the magic. That's what everybody lives for.
And Jonathan made a great point, which is if you look back in our careers and say, where were we successful? It was all the people that made the difference. It was never a technology. It was never, some fantastic deal. In fact, when you start pulling on the string, you don't know where it's going. But if you're setting out on that road with the right group of people, you'll get there.
And as I said, going after big problems that if you get it right, it should be worth something to everybody involved. It should make a difference in the world. If you're chasing the right goal with the right people, sometimes you will get there.
Yeah, question?
Is there anything an individual can do to help change the FDA?
Vote. We honestly didn't rehearse this. Yeah. That wasn't the point of the panel.
But I think that you can bring up specific issues with your congressmen and make them aware that the public sees that the FDA is a roadblock or an impediment to progress. Look at stem cells. 10 years ago, people expected stem cells to be changing the way we treat Alzheimer's disease today. Okay, we're a decade away from that realization, and it is in large part because of this this very risk-averse philosophy that permeates the agency. But I think you can talk to your elected officials.
In fact, we often encourage our companies to work with sort of patient groups where they have the disease, and we go on letter writing campaigns to Congress around a particular time, and the agency does respond, obviously, to congressional inquiries. One of the biggest advantages we always had, if you were a Boston-based company, is the guy that they loved the most and hated the most in Washington was Teddy. And Teddy believed that all politics was local. So no matter how liberal you heard he was, I'll tell you one thing, every CEO in Massachusetts, without exception, voted for him every time. Because you had in Washington your Mr. Fix-It. You had a great staff, you'd call, that's why, I think one of the other reasons, quite honestly, why we're having such an issue with the FDA, is he was somebody who bridged these two worlds. You could never accuse his heart of not being in the right place, but when he called up and said, this company is going to get a chance to try this drug, the FDA said, yes, sir. And that was often a good way. So you had the official sort of situation, you had a political system to mediate it, but he was an honest broker who was actually trusted by both sides, and we don't have that right now in our interactions with them, but we surely do need him.
Yeah, Chris?
I'd like to know what the panel thinks about the undruggable paradigm, where there's so many biotechs out there right now that are taking really a tremendous amount of risk in developing compounds that big pharma just doesn't believe will ever go anywhere. And given that the IPO market is not going anywhere, the M&A is going to be really hard in their 5-year potential life. So should biotechs become, in the current environment, should biotechs become more risk averse, or should big pharma become more open?
Is there time for the panel to open up? You want to do that?
Are we starting at this end?
You start with you. That's a great question.
Well, yeah, so biotech should, of course, be risk averse. The one thing, when I give a Malthusian talk, such as we've all done today, we're kind of missing is the fact that we're at a cusp of just enormous scientific opportunity to cure disease. So there is just no shortage of great things to do. So rule 2. Rule 1, start with the best people. Rule 2, you pick the best things to work on. So certainly that's got to be the ones that have, the sort of best risk reward. And the figure I put up for you, just as to kick around, is if you can't figure out how to get proof of principle in man in 5 years and $50 million, you better have a pretty good story. And we're working. What's undruggable? The idea is that you need to be able to get very convincing data, statistical, placebo-controlled, double-blinded data that people will believe, that proves the thesis. And the thesis has got to be one that really makes a difference. It doesn't have to be a big disease. I mean, Genzyme pioneered the idea that you could make big businesses and pay back these horrible development costs by serving tiny populations. But you're serving them for life. There are 40,000 people with cystic fibrosis alive today who are customers of their product, who wouldn't have been if they hadn't developed that product.
And there's an example where very vocal advocacy groups have played a big role, because they've demanded that those products for small populations are paid for, even though the costs may be tremendous. I mean, and Genzyme is the perfect model of a company that has decided, they're going to build the best product access and reimbursement team within the company that can go head to head with, CMS and these other organizations that set the standard for payment. So,
but it's really funny about your question, because when you work in the life science industry, any of you, whether you're doing it in the drug business or the device or diagnostic business, you have certain unknowns that you just don't have in the engineering or the software or the car business. So imagine if you were designing a bridge as an engineer And it wasn't until cars actually drove over it and it stood that you could decide, oh, I designed a good bridge. But in fact, what we don't know about medicine and the body is so large compared to what we do know, that we actually have to make something, test it on all these animals a bunch of times, and then and only then try it in people. So, and it turns out that the most intractable diseases, the most intractable cancers, the most intractable, horrible mental illnesses, these neurodegenerative diseases that if you've ever met any of these patients, is to have your heart broken. The way forward is not so clear. And earlier on in my career, I really wanted to do things. I was a real sucker for companies that were going to take on sort of mental health challenges. And we tried a bunch of different things that, sort of according to your thesis, probably they weren't very high bets. And in fact, they were so low probability that we went and got a foundation called the Stanley Medical Research Institute to actually fund these clinical trials. This is about $10 million a throw to test a schizophrenic drug properly. There is now a brand new mechanism of action drug in late stage clinical trials with a large pharmaceutical company that will probably enter the market in about 2 years, that will be a new breakthrough treatment for schizophrenia because somebody tried something that wasn't a rational thing to do. And almost every advance in mental health has come from something like that. And I am convinced that our solutions to Alzheimer's or many of these other diseases are not going to come from rationalists doing an engineering approach. They're going to come from somebody who has some creative insight and says, let's try this, and it's going to work, and it's going to be really beautiful. So what we want you to do is we want you to go set your sights really high for really big problems and really go for it and try brand new things. A lot of these old companies that didn't get to proof of concept on $50 million, they should be shot and killed. They should be eliminated. And that capital and those resources should be dedicated to new attempts at new things. So if there's a criticism that people could level at us, is that we don't do a very good job of
Predicting the future.
Well, not of predicting the future, but of getting rid of the ones that didn't work, because we're as susceptible as anybody else to wanting to believe that maybe, this time it'll work. And even though we know intellectually it's an 8% chance of success, you still really, if you just meet a patient, you just really want it to work so bad.
Hal, Jonathan, and Bob, thank you for a fascinating discussion. I told you at the outset that you were in for a real treat, and it's been a real treat. Thanks.
Princeton University's Keller Center, educating leaders for a technology-driven society.